Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society and this latest in a series of collections and history of photography talks hosted by the Royal Photographic Society. It's a real pleasure this evening to introduce Hilary Roberts. Hilary was a curator, well, she's currently an independent curator and author, but was previously at the Imperial War Museum from 1980. She was head curator between 1996 and 2013 before she moved into a research role. And I'm sure many of you will have seen the exhibition she curated and her publications. And I suppose one of the reasons for this evening's talk is her new book, The Camera at War, 170 Years of Weaponizing Photography. So Hilary's going to be talking about conflict photography and manipulated reality. Hilary, over to you and thank you.
Well, thank you very much and good evening. Writing a book on the history of photo manipulation in conflict photography has been an ambition of mine for many years, and I'm really grateful to the RPS for the opportunity to introduce the book to you tonight. The time won't permit a full overview, but I will try to explain what the book is about and share some interesting examples. Now, throughout history, information has been manipulated or weaponized to influence human behavior and opinion in pursuit of strategic or personal gain. Advances in communications technology over the past 200 years have placed the so-called information war at the center of modern conflict. For those who experience conflict, an indifference to truth is seldom an option. Exposure to manipulated information can erode trust, breed cynicism, and foster disconnection. However, it can also create a strong urge to seek and reveal the truth. In simple terms, this reaction is a form of self-defense. Now, all forms of media are susceptible to manipulation or weaponization in modern conflict. Visual media, art, film, and photography are no exception. However, as Susan Sontag famously observed, the consequences of manipulating such photographs can be far-reaching and long-lasting. On the screen here, we have Susan Sontag's words alongside one of the most famous examples of photo manipulation, which inspired David King's 1997 book, The Commissar Vanishes. Now, the commissar in question was Nikolai Yezhov, head of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs in the Soviet Union. He oversaw Stalin's purge of 1936, but subsequently fell from grace and was removed from any photographs showing him near Stalin. King's book appeared as the world was waking up to the potential of digital photographic technology, image manipulation software, and online publishing technology. And it served as a timely reminder of the complex issues and potential impact of photo manipulation, and has been followed by many other landmark publications. However, when I wrote this book, to the best of my knowledge, it was the first one which concentrated entirely on conflict photography. Now, the most familiar form of manipulation when it comes to photographs is the manipulation of text and the caption information. A false or misleading caption can cause lasting damage to public understanding and trust. Equally, it can inform, inspire, and evoke curiosity. But this American article from 1940 represents a fairly typical response to those photographs discovered to have been manipulated with the intention to mislead. A misleading caption can also damage or destroy reputations, including that of the photographer, if they have been found to allow a misleading caption to remain uncorrected. Now, the caption to Robert Capa's iconic photograph from the Spanish Civil War loyalist militiaman at the moment of death, sorry, has been questioned ever since it was first published in 1936. However, in 2016, Spanish researchers helped allay speculation by publishing new research confirming where the photograph was taken and establishing beyond any reasonable doubt that the caption, which wasn't written by Carper, did indeed misrepresent the photograph. There was no fighting in the area where this photograph was taken. So this was a manipulated photograph. Now, Edward Steichen's 1903 assertion that every photograph is a fake from start to finish is equally well known, and it addresses the issue of image rather than text manipulation. Steichen argued that a photographer's personality, feelings, skills, equipment, and motivation influence a photograph from its very inception. This is then followed by other interventions in the darkroom and elsewhere, such as retouching or cropping. And even the publication process represents a form of manipulation. Now, Steichen's concluding comment in his 1903 article, which was intended to be tongue-in-cheek, now seems remarkably prescient and very relevant to the Royal Photographic Society, it has to be said. In this image that we're looking at here, I downloaded a couple of days ago from Shutterstock AI. It was in response to my request for a soldier working on a computer laptop. And the cost of this image was a fraction of the cost of authentic imagery, authentic photographs, and it gives you a sense of what the challenges are in the present day. So the book sets out to examine the role of photo manipulation in conflict photography over the past 170 years. It examines how and why conflict images have been manipulated and the consequences for our understanding of historical and modern conflict. The aim was to offer a nuanced view of the benefits and problems associated with manipulated conflict photography. And there are some benefits. But I also wanted to help readers navigate what is a very complex subject and help them to get to grips with its terminology, which has evolved over the years. On the screen here, you see the oldest and one of the most recent photographs in the book. Karapop de Sathmari, one of Romania's heroes of photography, took this photograph, the bombardment of Silistra, in April 1854, and this was a full year before Roger Fenton arrived in the Crimea. Sathmari's studio and many of his photographs were destroyed during the Allied air raids of the Second World War, and this salted paper print is a rare survivor. But it is also a testament to the fragility of early photographic prints before toning processes were introduced to prevent them from fading quickly. This print is so faded that the image itself is barely visible. An unknown retoucher, possibly Sathmari himself, has used an ink and wash technique to trace the outlines of the horses in the foreground and add definition to the landscape. Today, it is difficult to tell whether the horses were in the original image or were a later addition. Next to it is a synthetic image generated by AI, All Eyes on Rafa in 2024. It was created by an Instagram user in Malaysia, and it purports to represent a camp for displaced Palestinians in Gaza. Some of the huts forming the slogan, "All Eyes on Rafah." Now, on 27th of May 2024, an Israeli airstrike on Rafah killed at least 45 people in a camp for displaced Palestinians. Users of Instagram and other social media platforms expressed their outrage by sharing this image more than 47 million times in 2 days, a phenomenon that made it headline news in the international news media. It makes no pretense to depict reality, but it gives you a sense that synthetic imagery has already achieved a place alongside photography when it comes to images related to conflict. Now, I'd like to just give you a brief look at the various forms of image manipulation and the purpose for which they are commonly used. So, the most common purposes for manipulating photographs is either to add meaning, remove meaning, or change meaning. And sometimes it can be all three at the same time. It's very difficult to actually put any image that has some form of manipulation firmly in one box. It often sits in many. The various techniques amongst them are the following, and these are the ones that I mainly consider in the context of the book. So now I would like to look at some of these techniques, not all of them, which are drawn from the book. And we'll start with color manipulation. So color manipulation has been used by conflict photographers since the 1850s. Certain colors can evoke strong emotional responses. A good example is red, which is the color of blood. Adding red to a black and white conflict image, therefore, requires very careful consideration, as you want to make sure that the reaction that it evokes engages the viewer rather than makes them turn away. Color manipulation can help photographers add meaning to an image, but the human perception of color, of course, is influenced by a variety of physical, environmental, and cultural factors. And that means that everybody sees color slightly differently. However, before 1939, creators and publishers of conflict imagery often regarded the addition of color as synonymous with enhanced realism. For professional photographers and their publishers, adding color also enhanced the impact, the cultural importance, and the commercial appeal of their images. An amateur photographer's decision to colorize a photograph was often driven by its personal significance to them. So let's have a look. So on the left, you see a very early daguerreotype taken in England by Oliver Saroni, who was one of the sort of more expensive producers of daguerreotypes. He employed professional artists to miniaturists to hand color, hand paint his images. Captain John Nicholson was photographed shortly after his marriage and before he left England to go to the Crimea. He was killed in action there, and this is one of the few remaining images of him. He left a wife and a baby daughter. So this item from the National Army Museum's collection is notable really for the delicacy and skill that has been used in tinting the image. When you look at the detail close up, you can see that considerable care has been taken to make this image appear accurate to the details of the uniform, but also have an aesthetic appeal in the traditions of portrait painting as well. Now, if photographers could not hand tint an image, they had an option to tone it. And as time went on, different colors and of different dyes in toning were used to produce interesting effects. Now, this is by Francis J. Mortimer, who some of you will know was president of the Royal Photographic Society at one point and was a very important contributor to early English photography. This is a cyan toned lithograph, and the choice of the color which evokes that of the Royal Navy is full of meaning. It's absolutely designed to appeal to anybody who has an interest in the Navy. Now, as I've mentioned, so much depended on the skill of the person doing the colorization. It's interesting that the aesthetics of portrait painting in India resulted in a particular kind of colorization, which often resulted in the photographs, Indian portraits and so forth, resembling portrait paintings rather than photographs in themselves. This image from the Royal Collection is a glorious one. It was presented to Queen Victoria, and it really, the heads have been mounted onto the bodies of the figures in the group, and it has been overpainted to the point that the figures themselves sort of you can barely see the photograph, although the background and the grass is obviously a photograph. On the right, you have an image for a hand-tinted snapshot, and it's important to remember that snapshot photography and hand tinting went hand in hand. My own grandfather found the most pleasurable part of taking a photograph was to sit down with his tinting kit and sort of paint his photographs. This, of course, is taken technically in a war zone. And one of the problems with this procedure is that it was rarely the case that soldiers had the chance to do this in the field. And I mention this because one point that we need to remember is that often colorists did not actually witness at first hand the scene that they are attempting to color. And so their choice of colorization is usually approximate and sometimes entirely imaginary. Now, color film, true color photographic processes evolved. We had the autochrome and other experimental processes, but the launch of color transparency film in the 1930s didn't entirely eliminate the need for or the desire to hand color photographs, because it was extremely expensive. But one of the key elements of the Second World War was the introduction of infrared photography for military purposes. And on the left, you have a very rare infrared photograph taken by the Royal Air Force when they were trying desperately to find the V1 flying bomb sites. As you probably know, the chlorophyll in um, uh, foliage is appears red in infrared film, and sort of structures which are camouflaged or painted green appear white. On the right, you have a modern iteration of this, the well-known um, series by the photographer Richard Moss, who, choosing to use what was now an obsolete form of infrared film, wanted to challenge the conventions of conflict photography. So his use of infrared in photographing conflict in the Congo in 2012 really made people look twice at the conflict itself as well as his images. So this was an example of how a technology can sort of be used in multiple ways and not necessarily those for which it was originally intended. Now, the advent of digital photography and sort of computer software for image processing, Adobe, Photoshop, etc., really has resulted in a burst of creativity and experimentation. On the left is a portrait by the American photographer Lee Craker, who spent several years in Camp Victory in Baghdad, Iraq. And his portrait project, he wanted to evoke the imagery of the past. In other words, some of the Civil War imagery with its sepia tones, but so this, which was very rare for the time, 2010, was a case where full color digital photography had not only been desaturated but also toned for artistic effect. On the right, there is an image which shows a trend which we are now all familiar with, where historic photographs are colorized. And this is to some degree, again, a problem. What it can do is telescope the gap between, or reduce the gap between the past and the present. So, these people, these three soldiers, which were photographed in 1856 and then republished as a colorized digital image in 2024, seem far more contemporary than perhaps the original photograph by Cundall and Howlett. But again, as I said earlier, the key thing if you're doing this is to be transparent about what you're doing and why, and also to not rely on algorithms or automated techniques, but to really do your research and look into the colors that the software presents to you. I'd like now to spend a little bit of time with composite images. There are various forms of producing composite images, but essentially what this is about is combining elements of a photograph, of different photographs, to produce another image entirely. It can really be a good thing in the context of conflict photography, as we will see, but there are also some challenges. Here we have a rare example of a working maquette for a photomontage by Francis J. Mortimer. The Imperial War Museum was very, very lucky to acquire some of his test works, and they give a very, very good sense of his process and the detail and skill that went into producing a convincing image. So this is a very, very famous image, General Ulysses Grant at City Point. It's a constructed image in that it has it bears no reality relationship to reality whatsoever. So it wasn't created at the time of when Ulysses Grant was at City Point. It was taken from 3 different photographs by different photographers, and none of those photographs were taken at City Point. So the US Library of Congress has done a wonderful piece of research in pinning down all the details of this particular image, which has been published online. And it just goes to show the motivation for creating the photograph. Levin Corbin Handy was a relative by marriage to Matthew Brady, and inherited some of his negatives. And it is probably the case that he created it for commercial benefit or as a souvenir for Civil War nostalgia. Now, in the First World War, composite images caused a major argument on the Western Front. You would have thought that the war itself was bad enough, but this argument had real consequences, which have lasted long term. So the Australian official photographer, Frank Hurley, was working in the Ypres salient during the Battle of Passchendaele, dreadful conditions, and he got incredibly frustrated simply because he could not get the kind of images that represented what he saw as the reality of the experience of fighting on the Western Front. Unfortunately, he was up against Charles Bean, who was his boss and the Australian official war correspondent, who subsequently went on to establish the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, Australia. And Charles Bean, as a historian, was absolutely adamant that to manipulate photographs and produce composite images in any way, shape, or form undermined the authority and the integrity of what they were trying to do in documenting the war effort of the Australian forces on the Western Front. And such was the debate that it ended their working relationship. So Hurley left the Western Front fairly soon after this. This is an example of what they were arguing about, one of Hurley's famous composite prints. If you go online, you will find lots of forensic analysis about how he put this image together. It's incredibly complex. So you can see 12 separate images were used to make up this evocation of Australian troops supposedly undertaking a daylight raid in 1917 after the Battle of Zonnebeke. The image itself was produced after the battle, so in 1918, hence the date, and it was exhibited in London, one of a series of enormous billboard-sized prints. But Charles Bean would not allow these photographs, which were very popular in London, to travel to Australia. And so they never made it to the Australian War Memorial until quite some time later. Now, Artists who used photomontage techniques were very much inspired by the various artistic movements of the day, so Dada, Surrealism, and also Soviet modernism. And here are a couple of examples from the IWM's collection. So on the left, John Hartfield, who was actually German, um, and a strenuous opponent of Nazism. He produced some really searing photo montages, and yet somehow managed to tell the tale. And on the right, an example of a war poster by Abraham. Uh, oh gosh, I can't. Sorry, by the official war poster artist, um, giving you a sense of the creativity that went into poster design, and the fact that these posters, which were displayed everywhere, this is part of the Careless Talk Costs Lives campaign. She talked, he died. It has to be said there is also another poster which is that he talked and she died, just to balance things out. But you know, the artistic creativity and vision which went into creating these pieces of propaganda in and around the Second World War is absolutely extraordinary. Now, composite images were also used as a means of expressing trauma. On the left, you have a favorite photograph of mine. It's a combination print created by an RAF prisoner of war who spent several years in Stalag 8B in what is now Poland and was then Lambsdorff in Germany. He was an extraordinary man from Yorkshire, and he created this as a souvenir of his experience as a prisoner of war. He had had a very tough time, very badly injured. The result of his injuries were that he would eventually lose his sight and be denied the chance to actually have a career as a photographer, which was the thing that kept him going while he was in the camp. All of it, he created this image um, in his clandestine darkroom, which was in his prison hut, using his camp bed and a blanket and so forth. I mean, his story is one of many extraordinary tales, but he managed to put together 5 negatives, themselves taken secretly, and produce this piece of work, which is a tribute to the Camp Escape Committee. So what you see there are not only Lawrence's own photographs taken secretly, but also examples of forged stamps and documents which were created by the prisoners of war who were skilled forgers. On the right, a photograph by Edmund Kesting, who lived and worked in Dresden and, of course, experienced the terrible bombing that shattered that city during the Second World War. The skeleton you see there was actually an anatomical skeleton, which was rescued from the rubble of the college where Kesting taught. And he's used this to create a series of pictures which evoke the trauma of experiencing this kind of bombing. Now, the digital age has brought its own versions of creativity. Cold War Steve, Christopher Spencer, who's based in Birmingham, is, I suppose, the modern day version of a political cartoonist. He produces these digital montages on themes and of the day and publishes them on social media. They've been so popular that he's now started publishing them, I believe, as calendars and books. So what started out as a small project to express his own frustration with the situation has become over time something much more. So this was when Boris Johnson paid an unsanctioned personal visit to Kyiv in Ukraine, but apparently had to dodge the media looking for him by hiding in a fridge. Make of that what you will. Now, military composites for intelligence and strategic purposes have been highly important. On the left, a First World War example. The First World War was when military aerial photography really established itself, but composites such as this, mosaics, were used to update trench maps for soldiers serving in sectors of the Western Front. But for at least 50 or 60% of the war, these photographs were not standardized. So they were taken with different cameras on different days at different heights. And that meant that mosaics tended to lead to inaccuracies in the maps that were issued to the soldiers. And this particular one, the Canadian Red Line at Vimy Ridge, was the point where that finally began to change. The Canadians were absolutely adamant that aerial photography would be accurate and sort of not enhance the dangers faced by its soldiers. So this was the point where the assembling of mosaics, composites for these purposes really began to become a benefit rather than a hazard. And on the right is a section of a very long panorama taken at huge risk by an Allied aircraft, an American aircraft, in fact, about a year before D-Day. And what you can see is that the annotations are earmarking, sort of identifying all the potential strategic military points. Moving to the present day, this is what happens nowadays. So this is where machine-generated imagery has really come into its own. So satellite photographs linked to artificial intelligence analysis have been used to generate damage reports of the sort of the Russian targeting of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Really, this one you will notice, 22nd of March 2022. That's just a month after the launch of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This image, after analysis, was deemed of sufficiently high quality to serve as confirmed evidence of a war crime. In other words, that the Russian forces, in their bombing and use of missiles and drones, had actually attacked non-military targets and were in fact targeting civilians in above and beyond the military. So this is where we are today. Annotation is an often overlooked way of adding meaning to photographs. Handwritten captions. This handwritten caption by a mother who lost her son on at the Battle of the Somme. She, it gives an added layer of meaning to this charming portrait. Um, Aged 18, one of the very best. Every time I see this photograph, it moves me. This photograph from Lithuania is very sinister. So what this shows are Lithuanian partisans who fought a very unpublicized war against Soviet occupation in the aftermath of the Second World War. They took to the woods and uh, they hoped that their activities would encourage the United States to join them. And they wanted to produce propaganda to encourage other Lithuanians to join them. And so photographers were commissioned to photograph the partisans. Unfortunately, the photographs often fell into the hands of the Soviet Ministry of State Security, and the annotations here are those which were made by the Ministry of State Security. And what would happen is that locals would be arrested and they would be required to name the numbered figures in the photograph. So who is number one? Who is number two? Who is number three? Who is number four? None of the people in this photograph survived. And it is, it is one of those very sad examples of an often forgotten war, which we are only beginning to understand now. Now, this is a fascinating project by Jeffrey A. Wallen of the United States. He did a wonderful project photographing the sort of survivors of the Holocaust with personal mementos, but also he interviewed them and sort of annotated their portraits with the Holocaust survivors' own words. And so this is an example of how annotation and manipulation can really enhance the appeal and the meaning and the impact of a photograph. Cropping, well, this is perhaps the most famous crop in photography. The one on the left, it shows Che Guevara, and the photograph on the left by Alberto Cordo was the original, which the editor of the Havana News refused to publish because he thought it really wasn't good enough. Much later, a cropped version by Alberta became an icon of the 1960s. You found it everywhere on T-shirts. It is a photograph that everybody knows, and it is just an indication of how powerful removing distracting details from a photograph can be. Now, cropping is also a tool for censorship, and this example is from a air raid on London, which essentially destroyed the part of the major parcel sorting office in London. Now, the censorship of air raid damage by the Ministry of Information was designed to sort of avoid giving any feedback to the Germans about how successful their raids had been, what they had hit, and so forth. There were no particular exact rules. There have been sort of talks about percentages, only such and such a percentage of a photograph could be shown, that sort of thing. But it really depended on the individual censor and was not often particularly uh, consistent. So this image has been really radically cropped by the censor. And what it does is completely transform the image from something which shows the scene of a disaster to something showing a worker apparently going about his normal business. Now, a little bit about censorship in the Second World War, and indeed all wars. Um, The censorship covers all aspects of an image. So, official censorship in wartime during the two world wars in every country looked at the image itself, but also very much the caption. And so, this on the top left, you see one of the Ministry of Information censors at work, Squadron Leader Elson, who was one of the senior censors and focused on Air Force material. And then you see the back and front of a photograph. Now, the photograph shows a padre uh, helping to rescue people who've been buried when a building came down on them in an air raid. And at the bottom of the picture, underneath the red marks, are men who are literally holding the building up on their back, and the padre and the others are holding the ropes to try and relieve the pressure on these men who are keeping preventing the building from caving in. You can see on the left that uh, some, more than one attempt was needed to get this particular photograph through the censor. And sometimes it is absolutely fascinating to look at the backs of these photographs and um, decipher the journey that the photograph has had, often stopped entirely, then resubmitted, then changed, then referred to another ministry for consultation. It's an extraordinary journey that some of these photographs went on during the Second World War. Different countries, of course, had different approaches to this. The British and the Americans had one. They adhered to what you might call, as far as possible, the propaganda of the facts. So they were mindful that if images were completely falsified, people would stop believing in anything that the ministry produced, the British produced. The Americans, much the same, but not every country followed that rule, of course. Now, here's another couple of examples. On the left, there is a photograph by Heinrich Hoffmann of Adolf Hitler at work just before the Second World War. Now, this is an interesting image because it shows how carefully Hitler himself policed his public image. Now, he personally was very reluctant to see any photographs that suggested he had poor eyesight be published. So Hitler himself has drawn a cross through this image, indicating that it can't be published. Scratching out details was what the Americans often did. And this photograph, which is quite an extraordinary discovery when I was researching the book, shows an American padre officiating with a Japanese wedding, one of the very few Japanese soldiers, to survive the Battle of Okinawa. Married to a girl from Okinawa, and this photograph, they scratched out the faces in order to protect the identity of the two Japanese. And the censor annotated the back of the print with "publish at your discretion." So, depending on how you feel the public mood is with regard to the Japanese. Now, More recently, censorship, unofficial censorship, has also been a factor. And this is a well-known image which was discovered by Ron Haviv and reproduced in his Blood and Honey Balkan War Journal series. He came across the Faco family, who were Bosnian Muslims who had been forced to evacuate their home. And when they were finally able to return to the home, they found the home, which had been taken over by Bosnian Serbs, had been completely stripped of all possessions except for this one photograph. And the Serbs had taken a drill bit to the print. So the lines you see, the vertical lines and the horizontal lines over the faces, were all done with a hand drill and it was left as an intimidation tactic in the home of the Faco family. On the right, Edmund Clark's wonderful series, Negative Publicity, Artifacts of Extraordinary Rendition. This redaction and censorship is core to this body of work, but this image has been censored or pixelated by Clark himself to obscure the home of an American pilot, a civilian, who participated in rendition flights. In other words, the illegal sort of abduction and movement of those suspected of terrorist-related activity. So under American law, the American pilot has a right to privacy. And so Edmund Clark censored this photograph and turned it into a message all of its own. Retouching. This is a discovery which I made in the archive when I was putting the book together, a wonderful album showing the photographic section of the French army in its headquarters in Paris, and a huge workforce and very well equipped facility. And in 1917, they created this wonderful album documenting all the range of activities. And here you have the print retouching room, and you can see when you look at the photograph that they're using the full range of tools. They've got an airbrush, they have got retouching inks and paints, and pretty much everything that you could need to retouch a photograph, a war photograph. Now, snapshots in the First World War found their way into the press, and often these snapshots were retouched by the newspaper's art editor. So this one has been scratched and overpainted, and it shows the moment that HMS Invincible blew up at the Battle of Jutland. It's a pretty unique photograph, but in order to make it clearer for reproduction in the illustrated press, it has been retouched and the explosion has been made more dramatic. Now, the airbrush has been a popular tool for sort of newspaper press photographers, press photography, ever since it was invented, and it can sometimes produce very strange effects. And this is a particular favorite of mine. If you look, you can see that the American soldiers on the left and the right of the print are actually missing part of their bodies, and the background of the college has been painted in. So one of the things I particularly enjoyed about the book was to include some examples of some of the oddities produced by the airbrush when retouching, often for the most benign of reasons, a conflict photograph. Of course, the masters of the airbrush were the retouchers, the official retouchers of the Soviet Union. On the right here, the retouchers, when Mikhail Gorbachev first came on the scene, felt that it was very important that his famous birthmark be removed. That policy changed once Gorbachev was in a position of authority himself. And of course, Stalin himself uh, did as much, dictated that any photograph that showed him to be to advantage, and particularly emphasized his close relationship with Lenin, would had to be worked on. And so this is a very heavily retouched photograph, including lots of airbrushing, showing which, as far as we know, is actually a constructed image. In other words, never completely, it doesn't represent the reality of the image whatsoever. Now, staging and reenactment. These two wonderful photographs by Roger Fenton, Valley of the Shadow of Death. I mean, there is so much to say about these photographs, including the fact that the caption itself, Valley of the Shadow of Death, absolutely no connection with the charge of the Light Brigade. There was another Valley of the Shadow of Death, and so on and so forth. So the caption itself is and what effect that has had in public understanding of these photographs is fascinating. But also the question of to what degree did Fenton and his assistant set the scene in these images? So on the left, you have all the cannonballs in the gully to the side of the road, and there on the right, you see them very carefully arranged as it was. Yes, so lots to say about that. And the consensus, I think, is that Fenton did indeed arrange the cannonballs on the road. This is an example from the French Commune, complicated image, which is by Ernst Eugene Appert, who were actually brothers, and the massacre of the Dominions of Arcueil in Paris. So this consists of a photo montage, and the bodies of the figures are reenactors on which the heads of the key personalities, who I believe at this point were in the Bastille, and that's where they were photographed, were mounted on the heads. And this photograph and the set were eventually, the sale of them was banned by the French government because they were deemed too inflammatory. Right, moving on. One of the most famous staged images of the First World War, taken by British photographer William Ivor Castle. Canadian battalion goes over the top. Now, this photograph, throughout my career, I saw it published as a photograph of, or captioned as a photograph of British troops going over the top on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Well, they're not British. It's actually a training photograph, so it's not an authentic action picture. And it was taken well after the opening of the Battle of the Somme. And Ivor Castle's reputation in allowing this caption to stand unchallenged evoked the fury of the photographers who were working alongside him on the Western Front, and I'm sorry to say has tarnished his reputation as a photographer in the years ever since. Another very, very famous staged image, which has been particularly high profile the last months, Lee Miller sitting in Hitler's bath. And, this was a genuine event, but Lee and David Sherman set the scene for this, and Lee herself posed very carefully. There is nothing spontaneous about this photograph whatsoever. Every element in it is designed to send a message. And of course, the date of the image is key. It was the day that both photographers visited Dachau, and it was also the day that Hitler committed suicide. So absolutely redolent with symbolism, this particular image. And it is such a powerful one that sometimes it has been a struggle in the past to actually encourage people to pay attention to just how good a photographer Lee herself was. And the great thing about the Tate's exhibition, the Kate Winslet film, and all the other projects that the Lee Miller Archive have pioneered and pushed forward is that they have really drawn our attention to what a stunning photographer Lee Miller was. Now, this is quite an interesting case study. It also features self-censorship. So this is a secret intelligence unit who operated undercover in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Very, very dangerous thing to do. And nevertheless, they wanted to have a group photograph with their mascot. And so they posed with their backs to the camera. The dog is facing the camera. And this image, the original of it, is in the Special Forces Club. But I find it a very interesting as well as entertaining image. Therapeutic reenactment. Jennifer Carradi has done a wonderful body of work in the United States to these are staged photographs, which sort of the staging is almost cinematic in style. And what this does is represent the trauma in the mind of a soldier suffering from PTSD, and the visualization of this trauma, it is hoped, helps the soldiers to and their families to actually understand that most difficult of subjects, what exactly it is that has caused the damage to this soldier's mental health. In this case, a bomb disposal expert had a very narrow escape, and he thought that he had not had any particular after effects of this. But some months later, when somebody used a camera flash, and you can see that Jennifer Carradi herself is standing in the image and her flash has gone off, the flash triggered acute memories of this particular incident and really caused a sort of crisis in his mental health. So this is a way in which stage management really can actually be a force for good. Constructed images, those images which have no basis in reality whatsoever. This is a very famous example, the Coburn-Langer hoax. Wesley David Archer made models of aircraft for a Hollywood film. And then when the Depression hit and they were struggling, he and his wife were struggling to find a source of income, they put together this completely fake book, Death in the Air, The War Diary and Photographs of a Flying Corps Pilot, 1933. And I'm afraid in America, the initial reaction was that these images were entirely authentic. They came over to Britain, and the Royal Flying Corps pilots themselves, who are those that were actually involved in most of the dogfights, immediately questioned it. And there was a very funny newspaper article which said that, in which one journalist wrote that if these photographs are actually genuine, they deserve to end up in the collections of the Imperial War Museum. Well, they're not genuine, but they did end up in the collections of the Imperial War Museum. They also ended up in the Smithsonian, I should add. So we're now back to synthetic imagery, constructed imagery. The war in Gaza and now Ukraine, as we've seen, has produced plenty of artificial images of this nature. And there was, in 2022, when these first came on stream via Adobe Stock, there were many questions raised as to whether this was an ethical thing to do. And I conclude by just showing you my own attempts at this. So, and it just goes to illustrate the pros and cons of synthetic imagery. I used DALL-E 4, and what I did was enter in the original caption of Herbert Mason's photograph of St. Paul's during the Blitz for the Daily Mail, and sort of sat back to see what the software could do, and this is what it produced. So synthetic imaging, artificial generative AI is with us. We need to work out how to assimilate it. It's not a photograph, in my opinion, but it is they can look remarkably like photographs. And I basically feel that whether you are an artist or an artist who uses photography, a professional photographer who is engaged in photojournalism or documentary work, whatever kind of photography you're engaged in, amateur photographers, the key these days for photographers is to be open and transparent about how a photograph has come into being. And the other important element for all of us as viewers and consumers of imagery is to equip ourselves with sufficient knowledge and insight to look at photographs and consider and question. So I will end my talk there. Here is the book. Thank you so much for paying attention, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Hilary. That was really, really interesting. And there's so many questions I've got in my head now, but we're a little bit short of time. So if any of our audience have any questions that we can answer briefly, please drop them in the chat. I think I'd just like to kick off actually and just ask, you mentioned Frank Hurley and his hope to create composite images. Was there any comparable photographer from Britain that was trying to do the same, or was Hurley unique in that sense?
Composite images.
Yes.
I think Francis Mortimer was the master of composite imagery. He produced The Gate of Goodbye, which is an extraordinary achievement. On the Western Front, and in fact, in the active war zones, this was the kind of thing that Hurley was proposing was forbidden. And that was the problem. What did happen was a great deal of staging and reenactment. So Ernest Brooks, sorry, who was one of the British photographers in Gallipoli and on the Western Front, got himself into trouble with Charles Bean, in fact, because he was applying pre-war techniques of stage management and styles to images of the battlefield, and the public mood had changed. What the public wanted was a real insight into what was actually happening, but also policies changed. So the crucial thing I think about the First World War, which is often not acknowledged, is that the First World War was not only the time when photography became used as as a form of mass media communication, but it was also the point that the concept of documentary truth in photography began to be debated um, on a wide scale for the first time. It began the war in all regions of the world, producing photographs which were representative illustrations. The war ended with real aspirations to create images which conveyed something of the true reality of modern warfare.
I think that then might be a perfect time to conclude this evening. So, firstly, your time and sharing your expertise, Hilary, this evening. I would encourage any of our audience that hasn't seen the book to get hold of a copy. And um, we were talking earlier, and Hilary said that there's Amazon have some very well-priced copies online. So as much as I would encourage independent bookshops, then you might want to check Amazon. But the book is will explore some of the themes and illustrate the photographs that Hilary has shown this evening. So thank you for sharing your expertise. And thank you to David Barber, who's online, for arranging Hilary to come and talk to the group and to our wider audience. So thank you again. And thank you for staying with us this evening. It's been really, really interesting. So thank you again. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.